It's a global story. It's an international story. It is one that a lot of people are watching tonight. President Trump, as you may have seen on social media, is doubling down now on his threat to essentially obliterate Iran tonight unless the Strait of Hormuz is reopened. So the president has given a time of 8 p.m. Eastern, so 7 o'clock our time tonight, before he says the U.S. and Israel will start bombing Iran's infrastructure. Joining us now is William Maka, political science professor at North Central College in Illinois. Thanks for joining us to help us kind of break this down.
Oh, it's always good to be here.
So let's start with tonight's threat here, 7 hours or less. Is it possible that in the president's words, and I think we have the social media post that he put out this morning, a whole civilization will die tonight, William?
Well, that word is very, very big, right? What he's talking about with civilization, he's talking about a people, a community. That's how we use a civilization. And we should be clear that the rules of war are absolutely clear in terms of who you can target and who you can't target. You know, in military war, you can target military infrastructure, you can target combatants. What you can't target are people, civilians, infrastructure, churches, mosques, the things that we would consider civilization. So I think there's been a reaction, I think, across the political spectrum today. So that language, saying that you're going to kill an entire civilization, is deeply, deeply troubling. And now, like to your point, the president seems to be doubling down on that. So I don't know what that means in terms of the actual attack, but I think we should be troubled by the fact that he's using this sort of language, which almost has sort of like genocidal connotations to it.
I did hear a reporter ask him about this yesterday. He held a lengthy news conference, and I think he was asked a question about, does this meet the threshold of war crimes? I mean, is this something that it would be open to something like that?
Absolutely, right. And I think that's the thing. And the president has said he's not worried about, international law, is not concerned about that. But we should be, right? Not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because U.S. troops are around the world, and we want to make sure they're treated in the same way that we treat others, right? And so, again, the rules of war are very, very clear. You can target military, you can target combatants. What you can't target is civilians. And so, even this issue of can you go after roads and water plants and desalinization and power plants, those are also generally considered to be non-legitimate targets. Now, if there's a particular bridge that's being used by the military, you can argue that has a military purpose. But for the most part, we should ask ourselves, what is something used? Is it used by the people, or is it used by the military? And if it's something that the civilians use, it would be an illegitimate target, and you would be committing a war crime. And again, there's not a lot of wiggle room on this. And so I think this is an important issue going forward.
Yeah, and we're talking about the language here. We're getting really kind of specific. The president yesterday talked about the fact that, others have said this should have been done a long time ago, trying to disarm, this dangerous country. I wanted to also ask you about the Strait of Hormuz, because that is really what's at the center of all of this, and this demand to have it reopened here within, again, the next 6 or 7 hours. The stakes are so high. Why has it been so difficult to break that open and to open up that strait?
Yeah, the thing is, there's just not a lot of good military options for the Strait of Hormuz, right? It's a very simple thing where Iran could have a couple people out with shoulder missiles and shoot down tankers. So in terms of the military operation, it's really difficult to make that entirely safe. And so we're seeing a situation where the United States, it is clear, is winning the military battle. There's no questions about that. The United States has devastated Iran in terms of their military capacity. But these longer strategic goals, we're starting to see that Iran is in a really advantageous position in terms of the Strait of Hormuz, because they do not have to give it up. And it's darn near impossible for the United States to do anything militarily short of massive troops on the ground to win that back. It's probably going to have to be some sort of diplomatic solution. So I think that explains why the president has been so frustrated. He's having all these military victories, but they don't translate into victories over the Strait of Hormuz.
Do you have any insight into, Iran's reaction? I know there was some movement yesterday through Pakistan, I believe, which I had to kind of Google it because I was like, why is Pakistan involved? But it sounds like that's something that can happen where they go through other countries to sort of deliver their stances. I'm just curious, as we're getting closer to this deadline, do you have a gut reaction as you look at this tonight? What's going to happen tonight at 8 p.m.?
I have no idea, because what we know is that it doesn't sound like conversations are happening. You're right to say that Pakistan was playing the role of a mediator, but the conversation between the two sides is very, very limited. And after the president's comment about, attacking a civilization this morning, Iran said there's no more conversations. So then the question is, how do we move forward? as I mentioned, I think Iran is feeling pretty good about its position right now. Its goal is simply, as a regime, is to survive, right? That's all it wants to do. And so the president is if conversation doesn't happen, if there's a deal isn't reached, which I think is not likely to happen, I think there's going to be some sort of military operation this afternoon, right? And that could push the conflict into an entirely different category. If the United States starts attacking power plants, water plants, bridges, Iran will respond in kind, attacking our Gulf allies in the region, right? And then that suddenly escalates the conflict to a different place, and it becomes much, much more difficult to find off-ramps at that point.
Bigger picture here, Professor, we've seen President Trump make some major moves. They've had major international global impacts recently. Is there a bigger picture strategy? What's the context here, or are these really kind of just one-off situations?
No, I think they're part of a broader foreign policy that the Trump administration has been implementing, and that's really driven on rejecting the order that has been established, really basically going all the way back to World War II. There was a sort of this bipartisan consensus that the United States would be the leader of the world, that it would push multilateral organizations, and it would be the leader in terms of security, but also in terms of the economic alliances. And the Trump administration has made clear that they're not interested in that. They have very little interest in NATO. The rules-based international order they see as pulling the United States down, and so they're willing to break all of those things. And so I think that's what we could even understand what's going on in Iran as part of that. The administration and the president himself has come out and said that he doesn't see value in NATO anymore, right? That NATO didn't come to our aid in this circumstance, so he's moving on. So I think we're seeing the unraveling of a global order that really goes all the way back to World War II. The question is, we don't know what the new order is going to look like, but it will be fundamentally different from what we've lived through the last 75 or 80 years.
Bringing it back now to more of a sort of a perspective of living here in the U.S. President Trump was elected on an America First platform. How does he reconcile this, and does he even need to?
This has been one of the more sort of fascinating dynamics to watch, because there really appears to be a rupture within his supporters about whether they're on board with this or pushing back against this. And especially on sort of the far right media, you've seen a lot of frustration with the president, right? They made the argument that the president promised no foreign wars, and this feels very much like a foreign war. So he's trying to manage that, where a lot of leading far right voices are being very, very critical. Even sort of the last 24 hours, a number of them have been directly criticizing the president. And this is the group that helped get him elected. Now, the president isn't up for election again, so I think he's got some space there. But if you're a congressional Republican who's got a re-election coming around in midterm, you're very, very worried. So it's really sort of interesting to watch the Republican movement and the MAGA movement deal with this position, because it's very inconsistent from where the president was in 2016 and at the beginning of his presidency.
All right, Professor Muck, thank you for joining us today. We'd love to check back in with you here as things develop, especially, after this deadline comes and goes, as the situation may look completely different. So thanks for your time.
Absolutely.
All right.